Okay, with the B alternatives, B3 in this case, Southfork Palouse, these are non-potable options, so this would be irrigation water only. So the northerly ones really didn't make sense to go to a non-potable for that massive size and pumping and all those costs to get it here, to use it for the irrigation component only. It just didn't really make sense. So it's really the southerly ones, the smaller ones that fit that pattern a little better. So for the Southfork Palouse, 40-foot high dam, so we're in that intermediate facility height, would store about 600 acre-feet, a little under the 720, that's our average irrigation. It's about 83% of our current estimated demand for irrigation. We'd use the natural conveyance, so in this case the Southfork, we'd store it behind the dam. When we're ready to release, we just let it go. It runs down the South Fork of the Palouse River all the way into the south end of town. We would withdraw it from the river with 2 intake pumps at the south end and then put it into a distribution network. This would be a new, separate, non-potable distribution network.
So it's purple pipe.
In essence, it's that.
No, it's not purple pipe.
It wouldn't be purple pipe
Right.
because there's some rules for it, but it's the same concept.
Yeah.
It's a
I
non-potable
get what you
water
mean.
system.
It's LOID.
Yeah.
Walter?
You can build an irrigation distribution system for the entire city of Moscow for $2.5 million, including pumps.
No. This is not the entire city of Moscow. This would be a limited system on the east side of town. They have a certain amount of quantity of pipe within their estimates, and I believe it's in the neighborhood of 20,000 lineal feet of pipe. The thought here is that most of the irrigation demand is in the residential zones of the city. So if you serve the easterly side of the city, which is primarily residential, as much as we possibly could with a non-potable system, you would probably collect most of that 720 acre-feet, maybe in the range of 600 acre-feet, give or take. So I don't think we would envision trying to run this non-potable system initially to the west side of the community, maybe in time, as the opportunity allows. But in these estimates, I think they were looking at focusing primarily on that eastern residential side.
East of Mountain View, east of Blaine, east of Hayes?
East of downtown, anyway. And
Okay.
as far as specific layouts, I don't think they got quite that far in this level of study.
Has anyone looked at the stratification of the city where my house gets 2 cents a multi-million gallons of irrigation water for hardly anything? The guy on the other side still paying for potable water to water?
Not yet. That is a consideration. When you get into these kind of systems, you have to look at, what do you charge for non-potable irrigation water? It's usually a separate metered system, and it usually is at a somewhat reduced rate from potable water, usually. And so then how do you accommodate that? And, is there an equity issue for the folks that maybe are in an area that are not yet served, that if they're going to irrigate, they're paying potable water rates versus the folks perhaps on the east side who get it first, who perhaps pay some percentage of a potable rate. You're always going to have that when you start running dual systems unless you've covered the entire
Lewiston's
city.
got that because the orchards has got per acre foot irrigation water, or used to if they don't still, and downtown didn't.
Okay. This is the least costly of all the alternatives. Part of the reason for that is you're using natural conveyance, so you don't have to build a pipeline, and there's no treatment involved. It's a smaller facility in terms of the impoundment. Felton Creek B4, this is also a non-potable system. The smaller of the sites, 385 acre-feet. This particular option has some difficulties in it. I was talking with our consultants down in Boise today, actually, about this very thing. There may have been a little mix-up on a couple numbers that led them down a path that they're not quite where we want to go. So at this small size of 385 acre-feet, probably wouldn't be a very viable non-potable system. So this one may actually fall out in the future. An alternative would be to go back to the larger facility, 2,000 acre-feet, and perhaps not treat it and use it for irrigation. It would be a little oversized at that point, and with the conveyance and pumping costs, I don't know that it would compete well financially.
How many acre feet in your B3?
B3 was 600 acre feet.
Okay.
Tom?
Do we know anything about
And do we know anything yet about the hydrology underneath the potential pools where we might have any increased natural recharge because of the presence of that water sitting on top of that piece of ground? Do we know yet if there's any potential benefit where we might be seeing groundwater recharge?
Right. Not at this point. This study hasn't gotten into that level of detail. The next phase, Part B, would start to look at those considerations. There is potential that you would see some increase in recharge because all of these perch on that granite
Yep, and it's
monolith that's underneath.
There's a lot of pressure. I'm just wondering.
Right, and so there's bound to be some leakage that would help supplement some of that natural recharge that's occurring. Okay.
Not like Spirit Lake.
Southfork Palouse again. This is option C3. C3 is where we start getting into the potential for recharge or aquifer storage, and so we're looking here at the smaller facility. 40-foot high impoundment, 600 acre-feet behind the dam itself. Again, a 5-6 mile pipeline conveyed to the city. In this case, you would need to treat and you would need to pipe it in order to keep the water quality high. Once you put water in the river, the water quality from a lot of parameters will drop. You start picking up the sediments and any potential agricultural runoff, all those kind of things. And so if you're going to use it in a potable manner, or even more so, if you're going to do some form of aquifer storage, then it's vitally important that the quality stay high. And so this option, again, the impoundment, the pipeline, the treatment, and then some kind of a system to introduce that water into the aquifer. Again, for the purposes of the study, they used an ASR injection well facility just so they could compare apples to apples. So those are all included in that. The concept behind this one was that the watershed itself will produce more than 600 acre-feet, which is where that 1,300 acre-feet number sits up there. The idea being that you could take some of that water, route it to the injection facility or the recharge facility, and put it into the aquifer, and then continue to gather and impound water behind the reservoir up to that 600 acre-foot level. So it would be one of those where you don't just store it all at once and wait and use it throughout the course of the year. It would be a combination of utilizing some to go right into the aquifer system and storing a certain amount, one of those types of deals. So it would vary each year a little bit in terms of how much you could obtain from the actual watershed itself. Price range on this, 10.7, so it's kind of a hybrid, if you will, in some ways, and kind of fits in between a little bit on some of the overall financial pictures. And the last one, D3, this is the only one of the Ds. This one really is in here just for comparison's sake. This actually came out of some of the discussions when you start looking at the costs and the feasibility of reservoir facilities. The question always comes up, well, are there other things that would get you there that might be better? One of those potentially is not containing the water in a reservoir site, but actually just in essence scalping it off during the high flow periods in the spring and winter months and treating it to a very high level, and then again storing it in the aquifer system. So that's what this is, using natural conveyance off the mountain, just let it run down a mountain. You'd have an intake system and piping system, treatment at a high level. You can see it's a very high cost for treatment because it is all a surface water run to that point, and then into a storage facility. It's really here just for comparison's sake to see what this option would look like as compared to the reservoir options that this study's meant to address.
Tom?
What's the capacity of D3? You don't have acre-feet capacity.
It's just the
Because there's no reservoir.
There's no reservoir on this
right,
one.
but I mean, how much could be
Southfork
supplied?
Palouse, if you're looking just at that basin, is about 1,300 acre-feet.
Okay.
There is potential
It's about
in a lot of
50%
these
of that.
options to do a diversion from one sub-basin to another. Felton Creek is a good example. Actually, so is the Southfork. Southfork, we've looked at the concept of maybe taking part of Crumorine Creek in the upper portion and do an intercept of the upper section of that watershed, kick it over into the Southfork to supplement the Southfork natural drainage, and that can raise the production quite a bit.
Drop back to your previous slide, please. I guess okay, it's the degree of treatment is what's causing the other one to be so high.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, in this option, it is a surface water from a reasonably pristine and controlled watershed above all the agricultural and activities and the lush soils, versus this one where we're letting that water run all the way through those activities and those soils, and so the water quality will degrade considerably just running through that type of a soil condition, if nothing else. And we have to then deal with the suspended solids and sediments that, and among other things, that would be accumulated in that water. So that's why it's a much higher level of treatment.
We built a new water treatment plant out of the clear water, which isn't always clear, for a whole lot less than that.
Maybe. And again, these are very much planning level numbers, so hopefully they'll be refined down as we move forward. Right?
So, Les, at the risk of sounding like a punster, is ASR typically considered a last-ditch effort? I mean, say the Grand Ronde seemed to be stabilizing, and we're maybe not in the panic where we're going to go, well, we don't really care what contaminants we put into our groundwater, we just need to drink something. I mean, as you've heard me say over and over, I know I just nag in your head, but I have a lot of concerns over the contaminants that we are not measuring or treating, and what will we learn and wish we hadn't put into our pristine groundwater.
Right.
So ASR is not my favorite option. I just want to say that again.
Yep. And I'm well aware of that.
Yeah,
Madam
but
Mayor.
I don't know if ASR is, the same, is equivalent to that concept of last ditch type effort.
I would say in the probably in the engineering circles, not at all. In many communities,
Right, I know. That's a distinction.
Yeah, there's certainly a distinction there, but in many communities, ASR is very much embraced, and there are ASR systems in the Northwest. They've been very effectively used. I'm not personally aware of difficulties that ASR systems have had with potential contamination. Obviously, the risk is always there. There is always a potential. Before I would suggest an ASR system, there would have to be an extensive amount of chemistry and testing done to make sure that surface water and the groundwater are compatible, because believe it or not, they're not always compatible. There's
Right.
different chemistry
Sure.
in water. And also testing for a lot of those constituents that you refer to that could be present, and if they are, then that may steer you in a different direction. And so it's one of those things that if you're pulling water from, again, a reasonably controlled watershed, the likelihood of some of those types of constituents or pollutants being in the water supply is much reduced. I'm not going to say they go away completely, but it's certainly you're better off if you're pulling from those upper basins. So, is it a last ditch thing? I'd say in a lot of communities, no, it's not. Here, perhaps it is. I don't know. It's something we would have to.
I know some communities
assess.
actually are drinking treated effluent, and I forget what they called that other than treated effluent. There's some other name that sounds,
More tastier.
Indirect
tastier.
reuse.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, Sue,
Indirect.
did you have your hand up here?
Well, would ASR be used in the Wanapum rather than opposed and leave the Grand Ronde alone?
Well,
Because, not that the Wanapums,
Might make
it take the iron out, it
Right.
might
well, and
be
actually, there's iron in the Grand Ronde as well, and a lot of people don't recognize that. I mean, Well 9 is very high in iron, and it's comparable to some of the
Okay,
shallower.
but anyway, where were you thinking about doing the ASR?
The thought is that if we were to eventually go that way, it would most likely go into the Wanapum simply because the cost of bringing the water back up from pumping is reduced because you're not putting it as deep. Right? So again, operationally, long-term, financially, it would probably make sense to go into the shallower. Again, you'd look at water chemistry and all of those things to see what makes the most sense if we were to pursue that.
And I just had one follow-up question. What about legally? I mean, you're talking about catching water, say, above Crumrine Creek. What about all those people that have senior water rights? I'm leading to your next
You're
slide.
right there.
Okay.
All right. There are
You should ask.
some interesting potential constraints that are out there, things we need to be aware of, and projects of this nature would have to work through these types of things no matter what they are or where they are. So obviously there's issues like potential wetlands. I mean, you're talking about waterways and water bodies, so there's always potential that there could be a wetland somewhere along the route that we affect. So either through a mitigation or a relocation of the facilities or some way you would have to consider wetlands. So wetlands assessments would have to be part of further efforts. Endangered species can come into play. The whole issue of salmonid spawning in most of the basins that we're dealing with are really, it isn't an issue on the South Fork because of the falls that prevent salmonid
But the other
spawning.
ones that go to.
For natural species, there are some planted species that come into play. Felton Creek actually drains to the Potlatch into Clearwater, so it is a salmonid spawning water body and would be subject to ESA. When you get on the north side, again, you're in the Palouse Basin, you're above Palouse Falls, and so it's a little bit simpler in that regard.
Whoa, whoa, you said on the north side?
The north side
goes
goes to
into
the
Felton
north
Creek's on the north side?
No, no.
Felton Creek is the southeast one. Okay.
Felton Creek goes to the Potlatch on the southeast side.
Okay, got you. I
The
got
two
it.
northerly ones would go
Going
to
to
the north
Palouse
fork.
River, which
Okay.
goes over the
Okay.
falls.
Bull trout, Chinook, and steelhead on Felton Creek are listed species. Okay. So they're out there. It's something we'd have to contend with. There's potential for cultural resources, be it Native American resources, historical, other things that would have to be considered. General water quality issues, are we high enough to get above any kind of potential contamination? Do we have an area that has particularly high sediment runoff and sediment loading, those types of issues, just the chemistry of the waters we've discussed. Land ownership. If you have a reservoir watershed that has 42 different owners in it, that's a challenge. If you have a watershed that has 3, then perhaps that's more attractive.
That's a challenge.
It's still a challenge, but it's more attractive, maybe a little less of a challenge. Could be worse, you just don't know. Water rights. Part of the study looked at water rights, and in the initial assessments, and again, these are not extremely detailed reviews, but just a general look at, okay, what's out there, what's currently on the books. We don't know if they're valid or not. They're the ones that are on the books. We've not been adjudicated in most of these sites. The Felton Creek isn't the exception because it's in the Clearwater Basin, which is all part of that adjudication that took place the last 2 decades. There's one right identified on the South Fork upstream of a reservoir site. It is a very small irrigation stockwater right of about 1.3 gallons per minute, so quite small, probably could be managed in some form. Downstream, there are a lot of rights in all the basins, particularly as you come down the South Fork. They are primarily summer irrigation rights, which is a good thing because then they wouldn't necessarily conflict with the winter right that we would have to obtain to take that peak off of the floodwaters. So that's a good situation. There is potential for downstream and Washington rights coming into play, but our consultant's conclusion at this preliminary stage is they're unlikely to preclude any of the alternatives. They're probably manageable. Okay. From here, where do we go? We need to finalize the draft study. In the scope of work in our consultants, we'd anticipated a workshop with the City Council to go into these options in any detail. That's something we'll have to determine if we still want to do. Before we could move on to a next stage, we would have to make some decisions on, of these 8 alternatives, which 1 or 2 or perhaps 3 seem the most viable that we would want to review further. So that's a discussion not necessarily for tonight, but sometime in the near term. So there's the review workshop. Out of that, how do we proceed? Do we want to continue? If so, which basins? If we are indeed continuing, we would need to develop the scope and budget for the Part B of the current contract, or perhaps a new contract depending on where we choose to go. So that essentially is my presentation at this point, and be pleased to answer any further questions.
Cool, excellent, thank you.
You're welcome.
Walter?
We're only budgeted through Phase A, Part A?
Part A.
Part A.
The current contract has a Part A, Part B. The authorization at this point is for a budget and scope for Part A. Part B does not yet have a budget and scope. It has a draft scope, but we've not authorized proceeding on Part B. There is funding still available in the line item budget for Part B, depending on what we end up with the scope.
In
In
your feeling
current
is in
and-
total? I know you don't have a number yet, but just your feeling is probably?
Probably, we're going to be pretty close, I would suspect, based on what we have left unspoken for, if you will, under the current contract authorization. What's left in that budget line item, I suspect, will get us most of the way, if not all the way through Part B.
Other questions for Les?
I think we asked her.
Well, I
We
guess,
did ask them.
you know,
We got a lot.
how feasible do we really think this is? I mean, that's I guess the question that's going to be on top of everybody's mind. There are the two weights there, as you know, dollars versus preserving the aquifer. So I guess that's the big decision we're all going to have to, and our antecedents, I guess, further on down the road as far as who's the decisions they're going to have to make. So if nothing else, it's interesting.
Well, it is, and I will tell you honestly that going into this study, I really did not expect to find
A lot
many
bigger than
options,
I expected.
and I was pleasantly surprised to find as many as we did. Obviously, the larger scale projects have a huge price tag and would probably require some kind of federal assistance. Most likely would make sense to go on to a regional basis and talk with our partners out there in the Palouse Basin. Under those scenarios, if you could pull all of that together, then yeah, there's potential. Again, those are the least costly per acre foot for surface water facilities. Now, if we're going to go it alone, there's still that option for federal dollars, depending on what size facility. The one that we potentially, or one or two that we potentially could manage on our own would be, that 5 to 10 million range. It's still a big number, but that's at least within striking distance of a community of this size. They don't get you all the water that you need for all uses,
Right.
but if we could, take 20% of our potable use that we're currently using for irrigation and put it into a non-potable and be in that 5 million range, maybe that's a viable alternative for us. So that's what we have to think about.
Let's see, Tim, we'll go with you.
Thank you, Mayor Cheney. You said that you had some general scope ideas for Part B.
Yes.
Care to share those?
Essentially what it does, it involves a lot of the same topics, if you will, but it starts to delve further into things like what is the land ownership, who controls it, is it possible to acquire control in some form. It looks at the topography and geology of particular basins more closely, and could involve things like some field work in terms of doing borings out there to get a little better handle on what the actual geology is and the structure, to see if physically the sites could hold up to a reservoir facility. Look at the questions of seepage. Are the soil conditions such that we would see a lot of seepage out of the bottom? And it doesn't do you a lot of good if you build a reservoir and everything drains out the bottom. So that's something you'd have to answer.
been
The
done.
water rights more in depth, the endangered species more in depth, the cultural issues more in depth. All of those other considerations come into that next round.
Thank you.
Tom?
We started with 19, we're down to 4 or 5. Are there any of those 15 that might merit a second look or a third look or whatever? I mean, are they just completely off the table?
Well, there are a number of them, particularly in the southwest quadrant, that are very small.
Yeah, okay.
And so probably, unless you're going to combine a bunch of them, you're not going to get much water out of
Yeah.
them. So those are pretty much off the table. On the southeast side, there's a number of longer basins and bigger basins all strung together. In the concepts that we got to, we went away from saying, okay, it's one watershed, one dam, and that's all you get. We started looking at, okay, because there's a bunch of these side by side, could you extract that water, scalp it, off of the adjacent watershed, or could you actually go across the peak of the mountain and take the top off a northerly watershed and run it around to a southerly watershed? Okay. Now there's a lot of complications with that, but it gives you that kind of cream off the top. You get the high snowpack at the very top of the ridge, and if you can pull the top X feet of watershed off a north basin and route around to a south basin, the capacity goes way up. And so there's some advantage to that. So what's before us right now is not just a simple it's just one basin and that's it. It's often a combination of several basins feeding into one reservoir site. So I think we've pretty much captured the ones that probably make the most sense of the 19.
Okay, thanks.
Walter?
Do any of your cost estimates have any land cost?
I do not believe they do at this point. I need to confirm that answer.
If I were to own land on Moscow Mountain, there are two scenarios. One, I own the land you want to put this reservoir on. Are you going to buy it from me if I'm willing to sell it?
Okay.
That's one
I wasn't
question.
sure if you were continuing on.
No, I am, but I'll let you answer that
one.
I own the
answer's
footprint.
gonna-
I own the footprint of the reservoir.
Sure. Yeah, the answer will depend. If it's the footprint of the reservoir, I suspect we would want to own that outright and have complete control of that parcel of land. If it's the footprint of the, I should say of the dam site, if it's the footprint of the reservoir itself, I would think we'd still want to own it outright. The watershed.
That's my
above
second
that,
question. If I own the watershed, what?
Then there's alternatives. I don't know that we need to own it outright. We could have some kind of a controlling interest in the property or some kind of an agreement that says that, there are certain activities that are permissible within that. The intent is to provide water to the reservoir and to the system. So therefore, by mutual agreement with the property owner, there would be some limited activities that would be allowed on the land and some that would not.
I can't log it.
There are watersheds that have logging that occur. They have to be done under certain prescribed rules and limited basis. So I wouldn't say no outright. I would prefer not to, but it does happen.
Bring your checkbook. Everything I own's for sale.
Other questions for Les? I think the land use considerations are not going to become any less complex over time. The population demands and demands of new businesses and new residents in our area and at our university are not going to become any less. So I think it's very timely that we're looking at this in depth as we are, and looking forward to what comes next. Thank you for your part in this too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.